Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Kate Angelo. I'm a librarian at the Long Branch Public Library. I'm happy to be bringing you this afternoon's program as part of our year-long series titled Our Story, which focuses on Black history, culture, and lives. Just as a library commercial, coming up February 23rd, we'll be hosting a book discussion group about the novel The Revisioners by Margaret Wilkerson Sexton. You can find that book on the app Hoopla with your library card. And on March 23rd, we'll be talking with a local author, Rick Gefkin, about his latest book, Stories of Slavery in New Jersey, with a focus on the Underground Railroad. Today, I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Birgitta Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a jointly appointed associate professor of ethnomusicology in the School of Music and African American Studies program at the University of South Carolina. Her research interests include music in African American churches, musical change and identity in Black popular music, and community archiving. She's published articles in the Black Music Research Journal, Ethnomusicology Forum, Liturgy, Oxford Bibliographies in African American Studies, and the Grove Dictionary of American Music. Her most recent publication is a chapter on Beyonce and race gender bias in pop music for the Lemonade Reader, published by Routledge Press. She has forthcoming chapters on gospel archiving in the 21st century, gospel remixes of Beyonce songs, and sacred themes in the music of outcasts from Oxford University, Wesleyan University, and the University of Georgia presses, respectively. She's been quoted or featured in media and news outlets such as Rolling Stone magazine, NPR, Vox, Public Radio International, and South Carolina ETV. Her current manuscript project is titled Worship Waves, Navigating Identities, Music in the Black Church at the Turn of the 21st Century, where she highlights the impact of post-civil rights era cultural movements and socio-political changes on the state of music performance, transmission, and worship traditions in Black Protestant churches of today. Just some quick housekeeping. We will be starting the program with Dr. Johnson, a short Q&A between her and I, and then following that, we'll open it up to questions from our audience. If you have a question, please use the Q&A or chat features, and then I will go ahead and read those. And with that, I open the floor to Dr. Birgitta Johnson. Welcome. I'm so happy to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Kate, for helping me get tuned in and logged in, and for the invitation to talk to you and your audience and the library community there in New Jersey and whoever's tuned in. I see we have a lot of people from around the country coming in and on various time zones. So thank you all for coming. And so today it's going to be like a, conversation, chit chat. Oh, I see. Hey, Tonya, how you doing? Okay, I see someone else. Yeah. Okay. And so we basically, today I'm going to have like a conversation a little bit, and then we're going to do a little bit of listening party, and then, dive into the playlist. I think most of you have it or have listened to it. And so this is basically, we're thinking about the idea of messages of research and protest and affirmation have been kind of woven into Black music in America since, the first banjos were refashioned from African memories. We talk about people, Africans patting Juba, and even the development of the ring shout. It kind of defied a whole bunch of 19th century laws against dancing in public gatherings for Black people, and prohibitions against Black faith. For generations, we've seen Black music continually reflect and give voice to the movements that empower people towards liberation and freedom, as well as provide a space for self-worth and self-love. And so we've seen Black composers, Black artists regularly kind of use music to tell a living story of the Black experience, as well as champion ideas of unity, humanity, the spirit and resilience of Black people. And even in the 20th and 21st centuries today, some of these songs have become iconic examples of these themes, as well as globally recognized hits, right? And so we could easily pick out some songs such as, most people may be familiar with the song by James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, and what that meant to the civil rights movement and the Black awareness movement, the Black is Beautiful movement. People can look at Aretha Franklin's cover of Otis Redding's Respect as another kind of movement type piece that influenced not only the civil rights movement, in some cases, the women's rights movement in the 70s. And then even younger people can look at and point to hip hop songs like Be Free by J. Cole or Kendrick Lamar's All Right, and even songs by Beyonce like Freedom and Brown Skin Girl. There are examples of these themes of protest and affirmation and resistance in Black music that have reached into mainstream audiences and also received worldwide acclaim. So this kind of idea that we have these different themes, and of course they kind of go beyond the Black community in America, is very, very common at this point. And then we start thinking about how we can expand on this idea of Black music and the global voice of Black music that goes beyond African American artists. And so I know in our playlist we have a couple of examples of that, thinking about people like Bob Marley and the Wailers and their song Jamming, kind of reverberating this kind of unity around the global world, but to the reggae beat of Jamaica, the reggae sound of Jamaica. One of the newer examples I put in our playlist is by Michael Kiwanuka out of London. He's his parents escaped from Uganda, and he's born and raised in London. He's a contemporary artist that has you that classic soul sound that puts you in the mind of a Bill Withers and a Curtis Mayfield at some points. But his song "You Ain't the Problem" also talks to and affirms current issues that young people are facing with what's going on in society. So before we get into our Q&A in conversation, I want to play a few songs and kind of before we get into how you guys experience the playlist, give us some examples of these three themes of resistance, protest, and affirmation from several eras and genres of Black music. It's actually quite a lot of diversity on this list, so we won't go through everything on the list and not all the genres, but it's kind of there. And some of these songs have not only helped to shape American culture, but also how we think about and talk about American history over time. So I'll try to kind of stay within our 30-song playlist here. I know this originally was actually 65 songs, or the 65 song playlist, and I kind of narrowed it down for our event today. And actually what I'll do is just drop the playlist link in the chat for people who may not have gotten it in time. And you don't have to have Spotify to actually play it, but just kind of look at some of the songs from this list. And under the theme of resistance, let me click over to our visual aids. There we go. Do you guys see that? Thumbs up. Great. So resistance, thinking about those first themes and some of the songs that are kind of in that realm in our playlist, I put in there Lift Every Voice and Sing. It is 120 years old at this point. It was written in 1900 by James Weldon Johnson and J. Rosamond Johnson, and we can talk more about the backstory of that in Q&A. Songs like Voices of East Harlem, Right On, Be Free, and this is one of those gospel kind of socially conscious songs from 1970, but most people know that song if you went to a performance of Revelations by the Alvin Ailey Dance Theater. So if you've been to Alvin Ailey, you've seen Revelations, you probably heard that song and not recognize it in that context. So having this kind of resistance type theme gospel song from a community-based choir, but now is touring the world as a part of this dance piece that now is part of American dance culture history. The song I mentioned before earlier, J. Cole's "Be Free," I think that's the first one I want to play first, and that is actually from 2014. And of these songs of resistance, I think I like this one because it gives us a different mood, a different sonic mood of resistance. Sometimes we think about resistance as very aggressive, very assertive, or very, very kind of forceful type of sounds. In the case of this one, it's very much more introspective, contemplative, and so resistance not being as overt in your face, but it's still resistance nonetheless. And so a few things before I play this one. What was interesting about this one is when J. Cole put it out, it was definitely in the response to the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. He debuted it on live television, so it wasn't on his album. He had a brand new album out, and it also was a part of David Letterman's last television show. So as David Letterman ended his residency as this kind of, icon of late night television, he invited J. Cole to be on it. And he did this very much pared down. We think about hip hop music, we think about samples and beats and heavy bass, but this was very much an instrumental based track. and J. Cole kind of half song, half speaking over this particular track. So I'll play a little bit of that. And that was one of those moments in television history when we have this very poignant musical response to a very tragic event. So I'm going to get out of our slide screen and go right into some sound examples.
And I'm in the now. And it don't take no x-ray to see right through my smile. I know I be on the go. And it ain't no drink out there that can numb my soul. Oh no. And all we wanna do is take the chains off. All we wanna do is break the chains off, man. All we wanna do is be free. All we wanna do is be free. All we wanna do is take the chains off. All we wanna do is break the chains off, man. All we wanna do is break free. All we wanna do is be free. Can you tell me why? Every time I step outside, I see my niggas die. Oh, I'm letting you know that it ain't no gun they make that can kill my soul. Oh no. Say, all we wanna do is take the chains off. All we wanna do is take the chains off. All we wanna do is be free. All we wanna do is be free.
Okay, so that was Be Free. And as I mentioned before, it was just basically debuted on live television. And this was a big moment because a lot of people were tuning in to the last parts of David Letterman's career on The Tonight Show. And of course, very poignant, I believe, on the performance. He sat on a stool, and as the song builds, the band comes in more. And so it kind of spoke to that moment and part of that voice of Black music, kind of to say what needs to be said in the moment. In that same group of resistance, we have some other songs. Brittany Howard's Goat Head. It came out in 2019, I believe. And actually, Brittany's up for 5 Grammys. 5 Grammys this time, and most of it's from this very same album. She's a biracial queer woman, her early 30s, and she's from the South. And in that song, if you listen to it, it had those questions about Black identity, who's Black, who's not Black, looking at racial violence that still are actually a part of people's narratives. In this particular song, Goat Head, she's talking about growing up as a child, and the whole hook, Goat Head in the Bag, is her as a child witnessing actually a goat head being put in the back seat of her dad's car because her dad was Black, her mom is white. And so people in the area did not agree with that. So her idea of questioning this type of racial violence, even in the 21st century, we think about some of these incidents of racial violence as something in the past. And so Brittany Howard is one of those examples of contemporary artists kind of dealing with these ideas of identity and also questioning. And the questioning sometimes is another way and a route towards resistance. And then lastly, A Change Is Gonna Come, that is in here as well, written or released in 1964. And besides being Sam Cooke being inspired by Bob Dylan's kind of social messages in his folk music, there was an actual incident behind that song, A Change Is Gonna Come. It was actually an incident in a hotel in Shreveport, Louisiana, where he and his the people he was with were denied entry into a hotel they had already booked. And so that kind of back and forth they were going through kind of partially inspired some of the resistance and anger in that piece. And of course, that went on to be this kind of huge hit, not only for Sam Cooke, and of course, the tragic loss of Sam Cooke right around that same time, but also spoke to that movement. This is the middle of the 1960s and the beginning of the height of the civil rights movement. This is definitely before we have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. I believe the assassination of Malcolm X had not occurred yet. So we're right in the beginning of how things are ramping up, not only on a national level, but the global eyes of the world looking at America and what's going on with this basically fight for civil rights and human rights in America, and the fight for voting rights and jobs and opportunities. And so that song had massive impact. We still hear it today. It went into the Library of Congress and it's in the National Recording Registry. I remember seeing somewhere, I remember, I think Patti LaBelle sung it at the Nobel Nobel Prize ceremony in 2004. If you go to the brand new National Museum, or not brand new now, it's actually the newer National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, and you go all the way up to the top to the contemplative room where there's a nice water coming down on the sides of the walls, the contemplative room. The lyrics of this song is actually inscribed on that wall. And so a change is going to come as a big part of that theme and how people are thinking about, even in the midst of still oppression, still injustice, still, violence, and still being kept out in this kind of racial unrest in our country and inequality. The idea of this hope for a change is still going to come, and being able to say that as a form of resistance. And we even seen it. I mean, one of the key things in Malcolm X, Spike Lee's film, the actual assassination scene of Malcolm X, that song is playing in the background. So how people deploy this song is very, very important. And also, we heard it just last year. Jennifer Hudson sang it at the 2020 Democratic National Convention. And so that song keeps coming up as this kind of reminder of forward movement and resistance and kind of belief in a change is going to come in the midst of whatever's going on. So that's kind of the first theme I think about, and I want to move on to the second theme. Let's see, I'll share my screen one more time for our lovely visuals. Protest. So we think about protests. We have a couple of artist examples here in our pictures, and they're very much known for their protest songs, even going back to people like Bessie Smith and the Blues. And protest songs are a little bit more overt in some cases. You kind of hear in some lyrics where there's actual speaking out against things that are not right. And sometimes it could be subliminal, like you think about our blues women and men who actually had, use of double entendre to either hide critiques of white society or bias, or even some cases gender bias or inequity or poor relationships and all that kind of thing that happens in the blues. It may not be part of regular conversation in the public, but always can be hidden in some kind of coded message. And so in this particular group, I want to play, I think, 2 or 3 songs. I want to start with one of the songs we have that's actually based around a quote of a civil rights movement activist. It's based on the quote by Ella Baker, and she gave a speech in 1964. And part of that speech took a turn when you gave it to artists like Sweet Honey in the Rock, and they created Ella's song. So a lot of people know this as Ella's song, but it's based off a quote from a speech. And so I'll play a little bit of that right now, so we can hear the words, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." And let's go to.
Oh, we who believe in freedom and not rest. Oh, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until they are rest. The revolution will not be done.
Sorry about that. So that was a quick kind of sample, and the full quote from Ella Baker in 1964. She notes, and I'll give you guys the link as well if you want to check out the link. This is one aspect of the link. Here we go. Until the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens. And so this idea of this very much overt protest moment, this quote being put into a song by a cappella vocal group Sweet Honey in the Rock, and kind of saying it. So more often that when people hear that, sometimes they hear Sweet Honey in the Rock, sometimes they hear some of the protest chants that came out of the Black Lives Matter movement where they were repeating this: "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens or until it happens." And so we see this kind of one piece of spoken protest becoming a piece of music, and then of course taking up to be a protest chant at the same time. The other one that came up just now, a little earlier, when I was talking about, let's see, the next song is the Something in the Air / The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. And this is a song by LaBelle. So if you know LaBelle, Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells became LaBelle, and they were known as a women, all-female trio. And 1973, on their album Pressure Cooking, they actually put out a song that was a pairing of a song called Something in the Air, and then at the back end, they did their own version of Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. And so this idea of even a group who's known for, Lady Marmalade, their kind of glam rock fashions, they're very much women-centric lyrics sometimes. They also were part of this movement of Black artists in the 1970s, having more socially conscious types of lyrics and performances. And so I'm going to play a little bit of that so you can hear Patti LaBelle basically reciting the lyrics, and you're hearing the other members of the group as well responding to this kind of live musical rendition of The Revolution Will Not Be Televised.
The revolution will not be televised. I said not be televised. It just won't be televised. The revolution will be no reruns, sisters and brothers. The revolution is gonna be live.
And so that last part of the poem, of course, the poem is longer than that, but that aspect of the revolution will be live. And now more than ever, we see that being the case with the rise of social media and instant notifications, 24-hour news cycle. The revolution is literally happening live, sometimes on screens, on phones, on tablets, and so this idea of the revolution happening, and we saw that with the recent years, where in the midst of these things, we saw that people recording incidences that are happening, and those going directly, not just through the news broadcast, but through social media spaces like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and people being put on to what's going on and the changes. And that's how we see in 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement becoming even more of a global movement, because people are being connected through this kind of live connection and communication. And lastly, of course, I want to put in there a little bit of Ozzy Brothers. Can't leave the Ozzies out. Their song Fight the Power. And that was, for me, when I heard that song, the lyric I'm about to play not only reminded me of course, Public Enemy's cover of it years later in the 80s, but also the Florida connection. If we think about 2012 in Florida, where Jordan Davis was basically murdered because his the people he was with at a gas station, they had their music playing loud and someone didn't like it, and they got out and shot at the car, and Jordan was murdered because of loud music. And so I'm going to play a little bit of this Fight the Power and kind of get to that lyrical part where it still had that kind of connection to today, even though this song came out over 40 years ago.
Giving up all around me, faces full of pain. I try to play my music, they say my music's too loud. I try talking about it, I got the big run around. And when I roll with the punches, I got knocked on the ground by all this bullshit going down. Hey, time is through.
Okay, now I thought they blipped that out, but okay, it was there. Hopefully kids wear your earmuffs. So in that case, that was another example of this kind of protest type song, Fight the Power, you got to fight the power that be. And of course, we saw that being remade back in the late 80s by Public Enemy for the Do the Right Thing soundtrack. And so it has these lives. And once again, very much part of the Ozzy Brothers sound. When we think about Ozzy Brothers, sometimes we think about romantic music, sometimes we think about funk and partying, but this is also part of how in that time period, you had funk artists, you had soul artists who would basically make danceable conscious music. And so it's still a part of that telling the story and keeping close to what was very much a part of having a good time, being a voice for the community, being a voice for the culture, but also speaking about what was going on in society. So our last stop will be in affirmation. And in this one, a lot of times when we think about, protests and resistance and music, and we kind of get all into that, but other aspects of this telling the story is affirmation, how the people uplift each other in the midst of struggle, in the midst of, oppression, in the midst of the actual terror that's happening in a moment. And sometimes that comes from actual songs of affirmation. And so, as I mentioned in the introduction, we recently saw Beyonce's song from the Black is King visual album, Brown Skin Girl, take on a whole life on social media where you have African American women dealing with issues of colorism. And so singing about the pain of what colorism does to women and girls, and also realizing that colorism is a global problem. So you have brown skinned girls in Africa, in South Asia, in the Caribbean, all over the world, talking about and being affirmed by a song that just celebrates darker skin tones and lifts them up and cherishes them. And so having adults basically in tears because they finally get to hear something that affirms their actual physical being, and also little girls looking up and saying, that's the example that I'm being appreciated here. I don't have to change myself to be something else. So affirmation songs have always been a part of it. You hear that in spirituals, you hear it in gospel music, you hear it in popular music. And so I want to start this one in another contemporary song, because I know we are very familiar with a lot of the older songs, like, the staple singer, To Respect Yourself. We think about, as I mentioned before, Bob Marley's Jamming, kind of looks at unity and people coming together. But the idea of not only affirming oneself, but also speaking out and saying that whatever these challenges are against your identity and who you are as a person is actually not your problem. You're not the problem. So that's why I really like Maka Kuwanaka's piece, or a song from 2019. I think it's on his third album. So I'm going to jump out once again and try to play that. Let's see.
What makes you blind? I hope to find who I believe in. Get back in line, I can't deny myself. Show me the feeling. Oh, you got me wrong. If you don't belong, live in the trouble. Don't hesitate. Time heals the pain. You ain't the problem. I live the lie, love is the climb. It's you I believe in. No need to blame myself, no need to die. I'm only human. I'm done, you got to put me on. I know when you come along. Don't hesitate. Time heals the pain. You ain't the problem.
Okay, before we get into the verse, one more verse, I'm going to slip out of this one and go right to the lyric. The lyric is going to say, basically, don't hesitate, time heals the pain, you ain't the problem. That's the chorus. And it says, I live a dream, I hope to be who I believe in. I used to hate myself, you got the key, break out the prison. And I hope to never see time passing, and so he goes into time heals the pain You ain't the problem. That's kind of the chant there. So I'm going to go and share right where that lyric happens. And that's once again, a younger person giving that kind of affirming type of lyric to the audiences. And of course, giving it to us with that soulful sound. If people who are familiar with the Isaac Hayes and Curtis Mayfield sound, or those kind of brassy orchestrated soul sounds. And of course, the vocals of him kind of reminds us a little bit of this kind of folk sound that we hear in soul music from Bill Withers.
Don't hesitate. Time heals the pain. You ain't the problem. I live the dream. I hope to be who I believe in. I used to hate myself. You got the key. Break out the prison. Oh, I hope to never see time passing. Don't hesitate. Time heals the pain. You ain't the problem.
So yes, that's the kind of goes really fast, but it kind of gets at that affirmation. You ain't the problem. So I love that one. And I'm going to do one more, and we're going to basically wrap it up with this piece. This is Curtis Mayfield, since we spoke about him before, a song from 1970, Move On Up. It has been in so many films. And this was on Curtis Mayfield's debut album when he broke away from the Impressions. He was in the Impressions. People who are old enough remember that and how the Impressions were great. And he became a solo artist. He was a great musician, multi-instrumentalist, as well as songwriter, and Move On Up. And so you give this nice kind of up-tempo dance song, lots of instrumentation, got, congas and things going on, lots of movement happening in the song. And this kind of forward progress, you're thinking about what African Americans were doing by the time you got to the 1970s. The civil rights movement, had several blows. You also see the assassination of President Kennedy happening the same decade. So by the time you get to the 70s, the awareness and the assertiveness around, the Black Power movement, Black awareness, people still trying to move up and strive for better, still trying to look at unity, but in some cases, unity that are looking more inward, and really being the idea of being self-pride, self-love, affirming yourself and your worth, regardless of what was going on in society. And you see that happening there. And of course, you see it reappropriate years later. So I remember hearing the song in a soccer film, if you guys remember, Bend It Like Beckham. This is basically a UK-based film. And the story is about a Sikh family. And so the young lady who's a Sikh and not really supposed to be into sports, but she's really good at soccer, as she starts to sneak out and play soccer, you're hearing Move On Up in the background as she's kind of coming into her awareness as a young girl and speak up for herself and pursue her dreams. You also, once again, hear it as recent as 2020. You heard it in now President Biden's campaign back in 2020. So this idea of move on up and people forward movement and progression, and also affirming each other as they're moving that way. And it has a couple of echoes of Lift Every Voice and Sing in the lyrics. So I play a little bit of that part of the song that kind of gives us kind of reverberations of Lift Every Voice and Sing as we listen to Curtis Mayfield's Move On Up.
Bite your lip and take the trip. Though there may be wet road ahead and you cannot slip, just move on up. For peace you can find into the steeple of beautiful people where there's only one kind.
So that little part, it said, move on up for peace you'll find into the steeple of beautiful people where there's only one kind. So this idea of, bite your lip and take a trip, though there may be wet road ahead, you cannot slip, just move on up, for peace you'll find. So this idea of moving forward, also acknowledging the challenges, also acknowledging the difficulties ahead, but kind of moving because you're moving towards something. That's why I saw that kind of parallel to Lift Every Voice and Singing. So we might get into that in the question and answer period, but for people who know that anthem and also see how this kind of theme is reverberated, in this case, about 70 years later, in a dance to a soul tune, by a artist 70 years after Lift Every Voice and Sing was written. So I'll stop there and we can get into conversations with Kate, as well as question and answer with the audience.
Sounds great. And just for the audience, as we're talking, if you type into the Q&A, and then we can just keep going with questions. So I think you touched on it a little bit, but just to start, how did you compile this playlist? What was your inspiration?
Well, the inspiration was actually a talk I was invited to, was a keynote talk that they were like, we don't want to do it the same boring speech or presentation. Can we do something different? So they invited, I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Michelle Scott. She's a historian on faculty at the University of Maryland at Baltimore City, or Baltimore County, sorry. And is it Baltimore City or Baltimore County? UMBC, that's it. And so we were going to have basically a conversation. We was going to have a conversation about Black music and these kind of themes. And it was for a conference. This is for their conference in September, their national conference. And of course, in September 2020, we were still in the pandemic. And so it was a virtual conference. So this was all virtual. And so we decided to have this kind of back and forth conversation. And our playlist was about 65 songs, right, of these themes. And so it was a larger playlist. And we had a kind of conversation back and forth. So this playlist kind of is a shorter version of it. I took some of the more songs from outside of that as were off the list, and kind of focus it down to these themes and to kind of a mix of new and old, as well as some things that I knew, can kind of come to our time period in this case. And so, yeah, that's kind of how it came out. And just, there was so many songs. There was so many to pick from. I didn't know what not to put on this list. And so I was just like, closing my eyes and seeing what would come up. And then some things I added to this list for this audience, because I was thinking, this is library audiences. So some of the songs that probably had more of the explicit language, just because we know we might have kids here, we took some of those out. And that's kind of how it came to be. But really those themes, I think the biggest thing about coming up with this list is the idea that protest and resistance was easy. But then thinking about, okay, how can we get into affirmation and what that looks like, right? And so that's kind of where the list came from. I think the September 19th in 2020. So that was the kind of presidential roundtable thing. And so I wanted to kind of bring that vibe to this particular audience.
Great. And you did mention Lift Every Voice and Sing. Do you want to touch a little bit on how that resonates in today's culture?
I mean, it does. That song keeps coming up, and people, a lot of African Americans in particular, know this as the Black national anthem. It originally was known as the Negro national anthem, and it's been with the African American community for a very long time. It was written in 1900 by the Johnson brothers, as sometimes we call them, James Weldon Johnson and James Roseman Johnson. First it was a poem, and then the other brother put song music to it, so it became this kind of anthem. And we think about anthems, if you are a person with a Christian Protestant background, anthems are part of the hymn tradition or whatever. And when it came out, of course, it's made of 3 verses, and it kind of spoke to the moment. This is basically 1900. Slavery was over, Reconstruction had happened and gone, and the rise of Jim Crow was in full effect, right? So as African Americans were coming out and trying to grasp their freedom and liberation and trying to get a foothold in America, this other system was trying to reinscribe slavery in America, basically. That's what Jim Crow was trying to kind of push people back into. And so those 3 verses are awesome, because the genius of them speaking to the past of African Americans' experiences at that point, talking about the present, and then talking about the future almost in every verse, right? So you got that going on. It was debuted and kind of in tribute when it was written for an actual celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation. They were going to open a brand new school, I believe, named for Booker T. Washington. And they were also trying to pay tribute to Lincoln at that time period. So it was actually elementary school was kind of the debut of this particular song. And within years, you see the NAACP adapted as its anthem. This is the Negro national anthem. This is who we are, what we're trying to go, and this we're trying to move towards. And so you see this song, and of course there are a couple of books about this. I think there are about 2 books about this anthem in particular. But you see this song being picked up by civil rights movements and activists. You see the NAACP in some cases, you see them starting meetings with this. You see in the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, activists starting or ending the meetings by singing this song. We see African-American churches putting in their hymnals. And so in some cases, you even see, when it's sung, people stand up because it's like an anthem, just like the national anthem. People stand up to sing it. You've had arrangements of it, Will Dawson, William Warfield. There's another arrangement. I'm skipping my brain right now. The one most people know, I think Roland Carter, I believe. His arrangement of it is what most people kind of know when they hear it in churches. And so it's kind of been there. It's been a part of the movement. It's been part of telling people stories. And then you have this moment in contemporary history where the NFL and trying to figure out how to deal with their issues and their Colin Kaepernick and social injustice, how they were going to figure out how to get out of the trouble they had kind of gotten in with that, had at one point last summer suggested that they start games with the anthem, the national, with the Lift Every Voice and Sing instead of the national anthem. And of course, that was kind of disturbing for some people because they see the anthem as sacred. And then you also have the issue of a sports journalist who kind of made this Twitter joke that, they're going to, be surprised when they find out that, Black people don't know more than one verse of the Lift Every Voice and Sing. And of course, that became a controversy, right? This is happening in July, right? And so when that person, tweeted that, I believe it was like July 4th tweet, and the next day, I believe, or the 2 days after that, is that somebody who needs to be muted? I keep hearing sounds. So I keep, basically 2 days later, Kirk Franklin released his version of arrangement of Lift Every Voice and Sing, and he ends this kind of video YouTube performance with his group looking into the camera. And so the idea that someone made a joke about, well, people don't know the anthem, they don't know the verses, they don't know the words. Their response as a group was like, no, we do know the words. The song is still important. We still sing this. And so I'll put in the chat Kirk Franklin's version of it. And of course, in his version, he did what we see Black music do. In addition to sing a shorter version of the anthem, he puts on a gospel vamp at the end. And this was an encouraging, affirming gospel, vamp. We'll keep marching on until the victory is won. And so they changed the anthem in some ways to speak to that moment, because not only are they dealing with this kind of, NFL issue and this kind of tweet issue, but we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so as gospel artists tend to do, they want to inspire people and minister to people. And so in the midst of using this particular type of song that a lot of people know, a lot of people are very, attached to, you also seeing them moving into this kind of affirming position, trying to encourage people in the midst of whatever else was going on in America and the world at that time. So I'll put the link into the YouTube from Kirk Franklin and his group. And that kind of, I have a snippet of it, but we don't have to play it now. I just want to make sure I put the YouTube in the little chat. So it has many lives. Over 120 years, it's still here with us, and people still find comfort, and it's very poetic. So I also teach it in my classes.
Okay. During Black History Month, we often hear stories that highlight the ways in which African Americans resisted oppression and found diverse ways to protest injustice in this country. We don't have too many conversations about the role that messages of affirmation played in a lot of these stories. The music and arts often carried these themes within the Black community. Can you talk about some examples of Black music that carry these messages of affirmation and their impact on American society? I know you did touch on some during your
Yeah, okay. Well, let me see. I'm going to make sure my sound is not the issue here. I don't think it is.
Yeah, I looked through. It looks like everybody is muted.
Yeah, that's so weird. Okay. I hope it's not Spotify trying to fight its way into the meeting. Down Spotify, down spot. So affirmation. Yeah, you don't hear that kind of brought up in the conversation. And when I think about like some of the songs we have on the list, Roberta Flack and Donny Hathaway's Be Real Black for Me. Those kind of songs are kind of, horizontal, in this case, a relationship and self-love in relationships. And so some of the lyrics are your hair is soft and crinkly, your body is stately. You don't have to wear, you don't have to change or in some cases, you don't have to wear false charms. I know I have love in your arms, those types of things. In the chorus, it's Be Real Black for Me. So think about 1972, when African Americans for the first time are actually saying things like, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, Black is beautiful, Black is awesome, seeing Black and Blackness as a positive as opposed to a negative. So you're seeing this kind of creation of self, this even more developing and being more outspoken, right? And also in the relationship matter, as opposed to you don't have to change or you don't have to wear false charms. This is this idea of love and self-love that comes from affirming one another. You hear that in those types of songs. And of course, respect yourself, regardless of what society is doing to you and talking and saying about you, you still respect yourself. So that's something that came up in that Staple Singer song. And there are a couple of others there, but that idea of affirmation as being a part of this conversation of protest and resistance and moving forward. And we have fancy words now like self-care, and affirmation comes along with that now. So even without the fancy words of self-care and taking care of yourself that we now know are important parts of life in this kind of industrialized country, that's kind of music has done that for Black people and people who love this music all along, right? So it kind of serves that purpose.
Okay, and the last one I have is there are some non-African American artists included in this playlist. Can you talk about the global reach and influence of Black music?
Sure. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna pull the playlist up so I can see it like with my eyes. So I know so many songs on there. I mentioned Bob Marley. We love Bob Marley. I'm not sure if I put a Fela piece in there. Fela Kuti was on my list originally, but his songs are so long. It's very difficult to find a short Fela song in the first playlist, so I may not have put one here. But it's that idea of the global reach of Black music. You think about people like Manu Dibango, who we lost to COVID early in the pandemic. His song Soul Makossa, becomes the basis for Michael Jackson's, you want to be starting something. So anytime we hear someone saying Mama say Mama sa Mama kusa, that's Michael Jackson reinterpreting a Manu Dibango song. And of course we hear it coming back again when Rihanna takes it up. And so you have this global sound of music. People like Mary Makeba, I believe the Pata Pata song might still be on our list. And so she's out of South Africa, spent quite a bit of her career as an exile because she was protesting apartheid when it was happening. And so she becomes a symbol of Black music and the global sound of Black music. And a lot of her music and her stance and her conversations about unity, about liberation of people and all people, that's a part of the story of Black music as well. So let me see, make sure I check again, because I think I had closed out Spotify to make sure we didn't have that noise. I'm not sure if that's on my end or something else, but let's see, who else we got in this list? Couple of them. I mentioned Michael Kiwanuka. Sorry about that. Him being a first generation British citizen. His parents are being from Uganda. You have, who else we got in that list? I think that's about it for this particular list. But having those global voices that kind of represent this Black experience around the world in music.
We've got a couple of questions from our attendees. I'm going to start with one. Did Black entertainers lead the way on the affirmation songs to address colorism and celebrate darker skin? I wonder if these affirmations came from the US first, then opening the way for folks everywhere, i.e. South Asia, Brazil, etc. Do we know if there was a subsequent wave of affirmation songs from other parts of the world?
That's a couple of questions, so let me just break them up in a little bit. I don't know about lead the way. A lot of times when we have questions like, who did it first? He's like, I always ask, why do we want to know who did what first? In this case, these are songs and things that colorism has been a part of Black music genres like for a very long time. We have blues songs that speak negatively about darker skinned women by some of the blues greats and giants. And they've been even redone by rock and roll people like Rolling Stones and those types of people. And so when we see blues women, for example, in the 20s and 30s, writing songs celebrating chocolate skin and dark skin, it had to happen there. We see it coming out even more so overt in the 60s and 70s, because a lot of the music before that lionized and praised lighter skin. So fair skin, tan skin, red bone, yellow gal, all those kind of phrases and lyricism that were in blues songs in particular. When we got into the rhythm and blues period, you start seeing people moving towards more of a language that affirmed dark skin and brown skin tones. And the Black is Beautiful thing was not only affirming those things, but also questioning why they were not being affirmed, right? And so you see African Americans actually questioning, why are you using skin lightener? And so in this particular case, that was happening in regular culture, but then your music also responded to that. So when people start to affirm Black is beautiful, and you start seeing women, you start seeing, in some cases, Black models wearing afros and wearing their hair natural and looking towards more Afrocentric looks. So the Afrocentric movement is happening late 50s onward. And so the music and the arts were already kind of doing that, and that kind of bled out. And so you have waves of that. So when you look at the Black Power movement and the Black awareness movement becoming global movements, as in moving into parts of the Caribbean and moving in parts of South America, as well as the Pan-African movement saying similar things. So you have a whole continent of African countries who are coming into independence and out of colonialism, and they're also affirming Blackness as the center, as the preferred, as the default. So you have this almost like an echo chamber of people affirming themselves for themselves, either out of post-colonialism or out of post-slavery or out of post, trying to get beyond Jim Crow. So you have a lot of artists doing that. So it's almost like more so reverberation rather than one person leading the way and people jumping on a trend, because everyone was having similar experiences with things like colorism. So when we see it exposed now, the next level of it is getting it beyond just African Americans or Afro diasporic people with all brown skin tones. And so when you see, for example, in Beyonce's Brown Skin Girl video, you see people not only from East Africa and the Middle East, but also South Asia in some cases. And so even though they're not African diasporic peoples, the same issues of colorism and chasing European beauty standards is an issue. So here we have things like FDA that oftentimes help us ban skin lighteners. Skin lighteners, however, is a big problem in the Caribbean, South America, Africa, and India in particular. We're talking about caustic chemicals being put on people's bodies to make themselves lighter, not just for aesthetic choices, but also for economic advancement. People actually getting jobs based on their skin tone is still a big problem. And so when the Beyoncés and when the other artists around the world make these types of songs affirming darker skins, they're pushing back against a global industry that pushes particular images, and then people within those cultures saying, yes, we are beautiful too. And so the artists are saying these things. We probably know more about it from our perspective because we hear American radio, American music, but other artists are doing it as well. And you see it in the visual presentation. And I think social media and video media helps that go faster. We don't have to wait to turn on MTV at 7 o'clock to get the latest video. We can go right now to TikTok and see various groups, people like Yemi Alade in Nigeria and Afropop, the whole Afropop scene. They are affirming these types of images as well. So it's kind of like that. I think it's more of a echo chamber of affirmation rather than people following and seeing, well, that's popular here, let's do it here. They're having similar experiences with it. So their music is reflecting those issues. And now, because it's popular, you have industry supporting it and playing it and saying, yes, we should. And so you see people like Dove and others taking those products off the shelf or stopping those types of campaigns that insinuate that darker is not good or not a good skin tone or something like that. So we see that movement happening way more now than it was when I grew up or even, when our parents grew up. Hey, I see Jeff there. Jeff Yerberton, soon to be doctoral student. Let's see. He said, with the idea of resistance, protest, and affirmation, showing Black and Black music to support our identity. Where was it first arise or discussed? You asked those graduate student questions. Where was it first? It was the same with those first questions. These are things that happen kind of from the beginning. So you ask the question, and when you say theorize, what do you mean by theorize? Africans in particular coming into an American space on a transatlantic conversation, being told that they were not human, they were subhuman, they were less than. They start theorizing against that as soon as they got here. And so they start doing that, number one, by doing things like the spirituals and having messages of affirmation that went underground about that. And so the people themselves did not assume that this was going to be their fate. When you look at how people wrote spirituals, how we see people write Lift Every Voice and Sing in the midst of Jim Crow, how we see people say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud in the midst of being beat down, like literally in society. Those are things that are people actually doing the theorizing themselves, right? And so when we see scholars thinking about it, we start thinking about people like W.E. Du Bois and the soul of Black folks and kind of talking about that. We see people like Zora Neale Hurston when she writes a lot of her stories based in the vernacular that Black people spoke and talked and told their stories and retold their stories. So we're at a library event. So when you read Zora Neale Hurston, basically starting as an anthropologist, and then she goes into retelling the stories she's picked up in the South, in Black communities. And then of course, she starts to create her own stories based on these settings, right? And so the affirmation of Black life is happening in literature, right? And so the idea of discussing it happened in things like the Harlem Renaissance. It happened in the Black arts movement. It happened in any space Black people were trying to fight for their rights. So when you see, for example, Sojourner Truth, saying, "Ain't I a woman?" Those are theorizations. When we see Harriet Tubman talking about freedom and how we should be fighting for freedom, they're theorizing about protest, resistance, and affirming the actual humanity of Black people. So when you say who first start doing it, the people start doing it themselves. Which scholars start doing it? Anybody who can write about the Black state and Black life. So when we see Lorenzo Turner saying that Gullah language is not gibberish, or Gullah language is not pidgin, it's actually a language, he's writing and theorizing about an African past of this group of people off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia that retain their culture. So you have lots of examples of that. And so for your case, Jeff, it's basically what field you look at. Different fields of knowledge based around the Black experience address those things different ways, but it shows up all over the place because the big structure we're working in is a society, a science, a country, industries that basically are negating Black existence. And so Black people and everyone involved in the interest of progressing them are writing against that. So it's kind of a pan response that you see in the culture, particularly when we start getting into academic spaces where African Americans are finally moving into African academic spaces and being able to write out these thoughts in some cases. So that's a long answer, but it's a very complex question, but I hope we got to it.
Anyone have any other questions?
I see a lot of things happening in the chat. Let me go to the chat.
Uh,
Oh, there you go. Thanks, Jeff. All right. Oh yeah, someone didn't mention that was Roland Carter. Thank you, Gail McDonald. So Roland Carter, I always try to not confuse Carter with Hayes, but the Roland Carter arrangement is probably one of my favorite arrangements because you get to hear the original melody and people love it. It's, high drama, and it kind of gives you the idea. And it's like she said, it's in a lot of hymnals, even in non-African or African-American hymnals. That song has been put in so many hymnals. And in some cases, people grow up singing it, not even realizing it is supposed to be the African-American or Negro national anthem or Black national anthem, whichever one we call it. And let's see, good things. Okay, I see that. Other ones. Oh, wait, I see Kelly. Hey, Kelly. Agnes got in the house. Let's see. There are some musical groups that had many songs that were based in Black. Okay. Yep, Sweet Honey in the Rock. I'll be happy when we get out of the pandemic because we get to see most of these people again, Sounds of Blackness. Oh yeah, so what Kelly is bringing up too is also some of the songs of this era, Arrested Development, Sounds of Blackness, and Sweet Honey in the Rock had their kind of close emergence to broader audiences like in the 90s. And this came with things like video culture, music video culture on BET specifically, where we could see different genres of Black music in video format. And so these groups in particular who were about affirmation, that was their whole goal. That was also a part of a trend where people wanted to hear that. And you also had record companies who supported it. So when people say, well, what happened to that era? What happened to those types of groups? Sounds of Blackness is still performing. Sweet Honey in the Rock is still performing. Arrested Development just came back, right? And so those groups who had those themes, they're still around. It's just the industry shifted around them. And so that they were actually following a tradition, especially when you think about Sweet Honey in the Rock, who was founded by Bernice Johnson Reagan. They were founded to do that, but they're also working in the tradition of other groups. When we think about the sound of Philadelphia and Philadelphia International Records, for example, when Holland and Dozier broke away from when they broke away from Motown, for example, they started their own record company in Philadelphia, and it's specifically to make this kind of socially conscious, affirming Black message music that still had a beat, right? And so when you see them going over and of course taking up people like Barry White, that's a part of that whole idea of we can make socially conscious, affirming music for Black audiences and Black music, and it still be popular. And of course, they turn into a hit machine and make hit after hit after hit after hit. And that also was a part of a trend of that era where people wanted to make message music. And then the record companies finally jumped on it. I think Bob Dylan's success helped a lot of people see that it was possible, because as we know now, when Marvin Gaye recorded What's Going On, it sat on the shelf. Berry Gordy held it back because he didn't want to get too much into that. He wanted to stay with the kind of dance music stuff. And then basically it finally came out. And of course, it becomes one of these iconic albums of all time. But that was a kind of turn where people were freed up to do it even more. Then, and actually, of course, it became popular. And then it took over the airwaves and then becomes a part of this era. And then in the 90s, you see with Sounds of Blackness and the Rest of Development, them taking up that same kind of look back at that time period. So you do have that, happening more now than the idea of going back to those groups that specifically are for affirmation and community and considering community and those community-based messages. And that's kind of mostly what they do. Good questions. Hey, love it. Okay, so in this case, I see, oh, that's Tanya. Hi, thank you for inviting me, Tanya. We never met before. We've been virtually emailing, so thank you. And are there any more questions? I think we're good. Make sure I haven't missed any. Let's see here.
That's all that I say.
There we go. All right. Well, I'm gonna let you have the last word.
I just want to thank you so much for being with us. Such a wonderful presentation. And thank everybody also for attending. And if you're interested in any of our other programs, they're all on our website, longbranchlib.org. And we look forward to having you again in the future.
All right, thanks. Or possibly meeting. Cross our fingers. Take your vaccinations. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone.